Good morning, students. In previous video, we read that how Tricky was overfed by his mistress, Mrs. Pampre, who was a rich lady, and his illness was only overfeeding. So when he got sick, then doctor was called to check him, and the doctor, without wasting the time, took the Tricky to his hospital because that was the only way to cure him. In today's video, I'll explain you the rest part of the chapter, what happened with Tricky at the surgery. At the surgery, the household dogs searched around me. Tricky looked down at the noisy pack with dull eyes. When put down, lay motionless on the carpet. The other dogs, after sniffing around him for a few seconds, decided he was an uninteresting object and ignored him. So at the hospital, when the narrator took the Tricky to his hospital, all the dogs gathered around him. Tricky looked them with dull eyes because he was listless. When doctor put him down on the carpet, he became motionless as he had no energy and he couldn't move. The other dogs sniffed him and observed him as an uninteresting thing and ignored him and moved away. I made up a bed for him in a warm loose box next to the one where the other dogs slept. So the narrator made a bed for Tricky in a warm loose box next to the where the other dogs were slept. For 2 days I kept an eye on him, giving him no food but plenty of water. So for 2 days narrator kept watching him and he had provided him only water, no any food. Means he was in water diet. At the end of the second day, he started to show some interest in his surroundings. After 2 days, the Tricky started roaming here and there and taking interest in the surroundings. And on the third day, he began to whimper when he heard the dogs in the yard. Whimper means to cry in low voice. And at the end of the third day, he started making some kind of noise while seeing other dogs in the yard. When I opened the door, Tricky trotted out and was immediately engulfed by Joe, the greyhound, and his friends. When the narrator opened the door, the Tricky ran with short steps. Trotted means short steps out of the hospital, and immediately he was surrounded by Joe. Joe, the greyhound. The greyhound is a kind of dog's breed, and his friends. After rolling him over and thoroughly inspecting him, the dogs moved off down the garden. So when the Tricky came out, all the dogs were rolling over him, they were playing over him with him, and they inspected him properly. Then all the dogs they moved towards the garden. Tricky followed them, rolling slightly with his surplus fat. As we know, the Tricky was hugely fat. He was walking very slightly, or we can say he was carrying extra fat in his body. He was also following all the dogs towards the garden. Later that day, I was present at feeding time. Later on that day, the narrator was present during the time of Tricky's feeding. I watched while Tritson sloped the food into the bowls. Sloped means to spill or flow over the container into the bowls. There was a usual headlong rush followed by the sound of high speed eating. So as soon as the food was served to dogs, all were in great hurry to have food. And they were eating with a high speed because every dog knew that if he fell behind the others, he was liable to have some competition for the last part of his meal. Because every dog was aware if he left behind, then he was responsible to have the leftover food. When they had finished, Tricky took a walk round the shining bowls, licking casually inside one or two of them. When all the dogs they had finished their food, Tricky took around the shining balls and licking the balls and to eat the remaining food. Next day, an extra bowl was put out for him, and I was pleased to see him jostling his way towards it. So on next day, an extra ball was served for Tricky. The narrator was so happy to see him the way he was pushing other dogs to have food. Jostle means to push each other. From then on, his progress was rapid. From then, there was a rapid progress in Tricky's health. He had no medicinal treatment of any kind, but all the day he ran about with the dogs. The Tricky had not taken any medicinal treatment, but the entire day, the whole day, he was playing with other dogs, joining in their friendly scrimmages. Scrimmages means fight or a struggle, and the whole day he was busy with in a friendly manner. They were fighting with each other. He discovered the joys of being bowled over, tramped on, and squashed every few minutes. He became an accepted member of the gang. So the narrator discovered the happiness of Tricky. They all used to play with each other, bump over each other, rolled over each other, and squashed over each other. Now, he became an accepted member of the gang, and all the dogs accepted Tricky as a family member. An unlikely, silky little object among the shaggy crew. He was different from other dogs because he was very silky and soft and little dog, and the other were shaggy, means they had a long hair, fighting like a tiger for his shade at the meal times. The Tricky, although he was small, but he was brave like a tiger. He was fighting for his share during the meal time and hunting rats in the old hen house at night. And he was hunting rat in the old hen house at night. He had never had such a time in his life. So Tricky was so much happy. He had never enjoyed such time in his entire life. All the while, Mrs. Pumphrey hovered anxiously in the background. Hovered means standing in same place for some time. Anxiously means worried. So at the same time, Mrs. Pumphrey was worried at home. He was standing at the same place for some time, or we can say she was standing in the same place to call to doctor about the recovery of the Tricky. Ringing a dozen times a day for the latest bulletin. She started making calls. She rang the doctor for dozen time, plenty of time a day for the latest updates about the Tricky's health. I dodged the questions about whether his questions were being turned regularly or his correct coat worn according to the weather. I dodged. Dodged means avoid someone. So the narrator avoid. He didn't give the proper answer of the question whether Tricky's questions were being turned regularly or his correct coat worn according to the weather. But I was able to tell her. But the narrator told her that the little fellow means Tricky, was out of danger and convalescing rapidly. Convalescing means recovering rapidly. The word convalescing seemed to do something to Mrs. Pumphrey, as Mrs. Pumphrey was not satisfied with the word recovering. She wanted the Tricky must recover soon. She started to bring round fresh eggs, 2 dozen at a time. So what she started now? She started to sending 2 dozen fresh eggs daily to the surgery to build up Tricky's strength, so that the Tricky improved quickly and to build up his strength. For a happy period, my partners and I had 2 eggs each for breakfast. For the narrator, those time was the happy period for him and his partner. They used to have 2 eggs each for breakfast. But when the bottles of wine began to arrive, the real possibilities of the situation began to dawn on the household. When the bottles of wine started arriving at surgery, they started that what the Mrs. Pumphrey exactly want. It was enriched Tricky's blood. That brandy was sending to the surgery to enrich the Tricky's blood. Lunch became a ceremonial occasion with 2 glasses of wine before and several during the meal. So instead of Tricky, who were using those wine, that wine was consumed by the doctor and his partner. Lunch became a ceremonial occasion, and they were enjoying the lunch with 2 glasses of wine before and several during the meal. We could hardly believe it when the Barondy came to put a final edge on Tricky's constitution. So the people were so surprised when at the last the brandy was also arriving for Tricky's health. For a few nights the fine spirit means brandy, was rolled around, inhaled and reverently drunk. So for a few nights all they were in the surgery, they were enjoying the brandy, they inhaled it and they respectively drank it. They were the days of deep content, starting well with the extra egg in that morning, improved and sustained by the midday wine, and finishes luxuriously round the fire with the brandy. So the narrator was saying those days were a deep content. Those days were very satisfied. They were very happy on those days because why the Tricky was in the surgery, and we know that the Tricky was very pampered dog, and Mrs. Pumphrey was very concerned about Tricky. She used to send eggs, brandy, and wine for Tricky's health, for the improvement of Tricky's health. So how they were starting their morning, they were starting their morning to use to have 2 eggs, and then afterward during the midday they were having wine, and at the night they were having brandy. So these all were the ceremonial occasion. It was a temptation to keep Tricky on as a permanent guest, as all the persons those who were there in the surgery, they were enjoying the good meal because of Tricky, and it was a temptation. So the narrator was intended to keep the Tricky for him as a permanent guest. But I knew Mrs. Pumphrey was suffering, and after a fortnight, felt compelled to phone and tell her that the little dog had recovered and was awaiting collection. But on the other side, he knew that Mrs. Pumphrey, she was passionately attached to the Tricky, was suffering, was missing to Tricky, and after a fortnight, after 15 days, he compelled to phone. He forcefully called Mrs. Pumphrey that little dog had recovered and you can come and pick him. Within minutes, about 30 feet of gleaming black metal drew up outside the surgery. So, within minutes, a 30 feet gleaming black metal drew up. A 30 feet black color car came outside the hospital. It was about 30 feet long. The chauffeur opened the door, and I could just make out the figure of Mrs. Pumphrey almost lost in the interior. The chauffeur means the driver, opened the door, and the narrator could just figure out that Mrs. Pumphrey was sitting inside the car, and it was not clear from outside. Her hands were tightly clasped in front of her, her lips trembled. She was sitting tightly closing her hands, and her lips were trembled. Oh, Mrs. Harriot, do tell me the truth. Is he really better? She was so anxious, she was so worried. And what did she ask to Mrs. Harriet? Whether the Tricky was really better? Yes, he's fine. There is no need to you get out of the car. The narrator said yes, he was fine, and he told Mrs. Pumphrey she sit inside the car. I'll go and fetch him. She said I would go and I'll fetch him. I walked through the house into the garden. The narrator went into the garden behind of the house. A mass of dogs was hurtling round and round the lawn, and in their midst, ears flapping, tail waving, was the little golden figure of Tricky. So there was a group of dogs. They were moving. Hurtling means moving with a great speed, round and round in the lawn. All the dogs were moving round and round in the lawn. And among them was Tricky, a golden Tricky. His ears were flapping and tails was waving. In 2 weeks, he had been transformed into a lithe, hard-muscled animal. As we know, the Tricky was very lethargic and hugely fat dog 2 weeks before. But within 2 weeks, after 2 weeks, he had been transformed. He had changed into a light means flexible, hard-muscled animal. He was keeping up well with the pack. Pack means a group of dog. He was enjoying. He was playing with the other dogs in the surgery, stretching out in a great bounce, his chest almost brushing the ground, and he built up his chest and it almost brushing the ground. I carried him back along the passage to the front of the house. Then the narrator took the Tricky to the front of the house. The chauffeur was still holding the car door open, and the chauffeur was still holding the car, and the door of the car was open. When Tricky saw his mistress, he took off from my arms in a tremendous leap and sailed into Mrs. Pamprey's lap. And when Tricky saw his mistress, he ran away from his arms and took a huge jump and sailed into Mrs. Pamprey's lap. She gave a startled. She was shocked. Oh! And then had to defend herself as he swarmed over her, licking her face and barking. And the Tricky was so happy to see his mistress, and he started licking her face and barking with overjoyed. During this excitement, I helped the chauffeur to bring out the beds, toys, cushions, coats, and bowls, none of which had been used. While Mrs. Pamprey and Tricky was busy with each other, they were very excited. The narrator helped the chauffeur to bring out all the beds, toys, cushions, coats, and bowls which had not been used during the treatment. He handed over all the things of Tricky to the chauffeur. As the car moved away, Mrs. Pamprey leaned out the window. Tears shone in her eyes. Her lips trembled. As the car moved away, Mrs. Pamprey leaned out of the window. There were tears in her eyes. These tears were the tears of joy. Her lips were trembled. "Oh, Mr. Harriot," she cried, "how can I ever thank you?" She cried, how a thank you could be enough for what he had done. This is a triumph of surgery. She just said, this is a triumph of surgery. This is the victory of surgery. So this was the explanation of the chapter A Triumph of Surgery, written by James Harriot.